Hello and welcome. The world's most strident critic of U.S. foreign policy just won the right to run for president of his own country indefinitely. On Sunday, a referendum was held in Venezuela to let people decide whether or not President Hugo Chavez could be limited to 2 6-year terms. The result was a lifting of those term limits. President Chavez said the victory was a mandate to intensify his socialist agenda for decades to come. But Venezuela has been split down the middle for a decade ever since Mr. Chavez took office in 1999. His supporters say that he has redistributed oil riches to provide cheap food, free education and quality health care. His critics warn of an impending dictatorship. Hugo Chavez is not the only Latin American leader looking for a longer term. Bolivia passed a similar amendment last month, and the leaders of Colombia and Nicaragua are said to be seeking the same. So today we ask, what does Venezuela's referendum mean for the Chavez revolution? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE and enter the chat room, and you can take part. We also welcome your phone calls on the show. Well, my guest today is Dr. Moises Naim, who was Venezuela's Minister of Trade and Industry in the early 1990s. He's currently the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, an influential bi-monthly magazine based here in Washington, D.C., covering global affairs. Now, before we get to him, let's get straight to the Venezuelan capital, Caracas, to get an update on the latest situation after Sunday's referendum. Our correspondent there, Mariana Sanchez, joins us. Mariana, good to have you with us. And I want to ask you what President Chavez's right to run again now means for his socialist revolution when you consider the economic situation there.
Well, I think there are tough times ahead, Riz. If you come to think of the slump in oil prices, that's going to be very difficult for President Chavez this year. This economy, the Venezuelan economy, is dependent on the oil. Just to think about the numbers, 55% of the revenues in this country come from the oil industry. And also 93% of its exports are also based on the oil industry. So most of the money that comes in comes from the oil business, and the Venezuelan crude has lost around 3/4 of its value. So this year, President Hugo Chavez is going to receive much less money than before, much less money to be able to give some of this or a lot of this money to the social programs. So what the experts are saying here is that that President Hugo Chavez may be forced to cut some of these programs that are essential to his popularity and essential for the poor people who suffer a lot here in Venezuela. What will the president do? Well, he has said that Venezuela will be able to weather the storm, that the economy will remain intact. However, that's not what the experts are saying. The inflation in this country is the highest in Latin America. So President Hugo Chavez will be having tough times ahead. So what the opposition people are saying and what many people are asking themselves is, what will happen to the support the president has if indeed a recession hits the streets of Venezuela?
Mariana, quick thought. You were mentioning the opposition there. How surprised were they by this outcome? Wasn't it pretty much expected?
I don't think they were very surprised at the outcome because the polls throughout this campaign have been neck to neck. However, I think that they realize that they have to change their approach to gain the votes of a lot of people in Venezuela who are not happy with President Hugo Chavez, but at the same time who are not happy with what the opposition parties offered to them.
Right.
They are sort of in the middle. Some of them said they do not want the opposition to have. The opposition doesn't offer anything. So what they are saying, these political parties, these political leaders, at least some of them, is that they have to approach the poor people in a different way and let them feel that they should not be. That they will not be disenfranchised as they have been in the past. Mariana
Sanchez in Caracas, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you. Well, let's get to Dr. Moises Naim, who's with us here in the office now in the studio, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. Sir, good that you could join us.
Thank you.
I want to ask how you see this outcome of this referendum. I know you've been somewhat of a critic when it comes to the policies of Hugo Chavez, but essentially you see it as a good or bad thing that he's been able to do this?
Well, President Chavez himself predicted this outcome 15 months ago. 15 months ago, he tried to have another referendum. It did not try. He had another referendum asking to lift term limits to enable him to run indefinitely, and he lost. And after losing, he immediately said, we will repeat this as many times as necessary. until I win. And in fact, he only took, it just took him 15 months, and he deployed massive resources of the state to influence the vote.
Actually, I want to touch on that for an email we had from a viewer called Jure in Slovenia, who writes in saying, Venezuelans voted in 2007 about a similar question. They said no, as you mentioned. I hope that there will not be a referendum for constitutional changes every year. Hugo Chavez just wants to legitimize his dictatorship. Now, you say he used resources to pass it this time, but how was he able to influence people to be able to swing the vote?
In the last few years, the Venezuelan economy has dramatically shifted in terms of the destruction of private sector jobs and the expansion of public sector jobs. So a large number of people in Venezuela today depend for their livelihood in jobs in government, for handouts, for subsidies, for access to a whole variety of social services. And so the government now used that as a tool. They mobilized all the beneficiaries of these benefits, and put them to vote. So it was, this last election was more about logistics than about politics.
If you look at it at the base level, though, ultimately, if he's, as many poor Venezuelans who support him are saying, he's putting food on the table, he is providing jobs, and he's championing their causes, is that such a bad thing?
Well, but you have to think that half of them, half of the poor, the vote was almost split in half. He won by 9%, but mostly split in half. Venezuela doesn't have a middle class that is that large. Venezuela doesn't have a wealthy class that is that large. So for half of the country, for 47% of the country to vote against Chavez means that millions and millions of the poor that are presumably the beneficiaries of his programs are voting against him.
Well, another email actually that came in from Canada, from Sasha in Canada, who says, laws limiting the term of rule of an elected leader are there to protect a nation from despotism and dictatorship. But Mr. Chavez seems to have done great deeds for his country during his leadership. Who is to say that under a new leader, the progress made would not be destroyed? That's to say that perhaps consistency is a little safer.
Well, that's dictatorships say that. All dictators say that they need to stay in power to ensure the stability of the country, and we know what where that takes us.
In fact, another email here, which is perhaps on the other hand from Britain against extended leadership. I want to get these viewer questions in because Robert Henderson in Somerset in the UK says, looking closer to home, I'm personally against any government being in power too long, as is in the case of the UK. Corruption is rife and we have become more of an elective dictatorship. And I wonder, when you look at the way he's positioning himself, Hugo Chavez is positioning himself, how has he affected the opposition to make them less effective against him?
The opposition against strong leaders that are a bit authoritarian in their style, or quite authoritarian in their style, is very common. It's the opposition to Francisco Franco for many decades in Spain. It's the opposition to General Pinochet in Chile, the opposition to Milosevic, or the opposition in Russia today. It's very hard to run against this Goliath. The saying now in Venezuela is that this was a contest between David and Goliath won.
He doesn't seem to, at least in the media, doesn't seem to use the kind of harsh tactics that some of these others you've mentioned have in the past. I mean, Franco and so on, they were considered very hardline military dictatorships who used force basically to put down their oppressors.
Well, that depends on who you ask in Venezuela. If you ask some of the Venezuelan opposition today is essentially formed, and the leadership is formed by university students. There's a wide coalition of university students, and they have been harassed. They have been there has been a lot of violence used against the opposition by militias that are associated with the government. You cannot say the reverse. The opposition has not used violence against the government or the supporters of Mr. Chavez.
Extending on that idea, from our live station, we have a chat room on livestation.com that runs debating this as we are live. Patrick in the US, who's in the live station, says, how influential is the Venezuelan opposition to Chavez's government, and could they significantly curb his power?
Well, no. Again, I just said it. It's David and Goliath. Chavez is Goliath, and now the story is not that David is winning over Goliath, because Goliath is using all of his strength and all of his resources.
So no prospect to mobilize against him.
Well, there is an opportunity, but it's very limited. It's very hard.
Sir, we had I wanted to ask you about an idea that Hugo Chavez is just one of a number of leaders in Latin America on this left-leaning side who seem to be trying to extend their term, as we said in the introduction. And he's financially supported his allies in Cuba, in Bolivia, Ecuador and Argentina. And I wonder how winning this referendum affects his position as far as his regional allies.
Even more important than the referendum that took place on a Sunday, it was the news on Friday that the oil has dropped even more. Chavez is very dependent on oil money that he manages at his will to both gain and win influence overseas, and also to gain popularity at home. So the price of oil is as important for his influence overseas and in the country as is his ideas or his charisma.
In terms of support for him, there's a viewer in another Latin American country from Mexico, judging by this email. This viewer said, Angela in Mexico says, Mr. Chavez is honest, noble, strong and intelligent. All of Latin America needs him. I pray that one day there will appear a Chavez here in Mexico to destroy crime and corruption. I guess people are looking for something. They're looking for strong leadership as well. And perhaps that's where his support comes from?
Well, the viewer says, you know, destroy crime and corruption. In the 10 years that President Chavez has been in power, which is the longest head of state in the hemisphere in power. There's no one that has been in power for so long. He has a free hands in terms of money, in terms of resources, in terms of the political power, and yet crime is soaring. Crime, Venezuela and Caracas in particular today is one of the most dangerous city in Latin America. And as far as corruption, you know, corruption is also soaring. So there's no evidence that President Chavez has been a fighter against corruption or against crime, much to the contrary.
Dr. Naim, I have more questions. We're going to take a very short break here, though more of our discussion as we return. But as we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments. Just log on to livestation.com and just enter the chat room. You can see the debate taking place there below me. We'll be right back.